Hey guys, welcome to the I Hope They Hear This podcast. And we have a very special guest with us today. It's weird to say this because I kind of feel like I know you because you were a frequent guest on the KTL podcast, which I really enjoyed. And um, you're here and I'm getting to talk to you. So
Yeah,
it's
no, I'm
really,
honored. Yeah.
it's really nice to meet you, Dr. Stan Sonu. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I know we kind of arranged this on short notice, and I'm grateful that we can have this conversation and continue this discussion on some really important issues of today.
Yeah. Yeah. And before we get into that, just for the listeners who might not know you, can we kind of get into your background, kind of who you are? And I'm
Mhm.
sure people are already curious because I've addressed you as doctor. So yeah, if we can get into that a little bit, uh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So from now on, you're just calling me Stan. Uh, yeah, I'm a physician by profession, and I'm employed by Emory, but I spend 100% of my time down at Grady, which is downtown Atlanta. Um, Grady is kind of known for the place people go if there's some sort of trauma or like car accident, gunshot type of thing. That's the stereotype, but my training is actually in internal medicine and pediatrics. So I deal with everything kind of that can go wrong inside the body in both adults and children. And prior, so my wife and I, and our son and our daughter, who was born this past year, we moved from Chicago in 2018 down here. But I actually grew up in Atlanta, so it was nice to kind of reconnect with a lot of people after having been in Chicago for like 7 or 8 years. Yeah, when I was looking for jobs, my mom really, I mean, I'm not going to say she begged me, but she strongly encouraged me to look at some place in Atlanta to consider as a job. And I told her the only place that I was interested in working at was Grady. And I think a lot of that will kind of come out in the conversation that we have. But yeah, I love it. It's a difficult place to be for a lot of reasons. It's a broken place in a lot of ways. But I tell people that I have the privilege of driving out of when I drive out of the parking garage at Grady every day, I feel like I'm a part of the fight. I'm doing something that counts. I'm doing something that matters, and yeah, that's huge. That's everything that I had hoped for in a career. So I love it. I'm a Grady doc.
Wow. So do you, this is kind of a side question, but have you
Mhm.
been dealing with COVID patients recently?
Oh yeah, yeah. We were kind of bracing for the worst at Grady, and I'll say that we definitely got our fair share. Fortunately, we didn't have a situation where our intensive care units, our ICUs, were overwhelmed. But COVID's still around. It hasn't gone away. It's still something that we are on guard against. I wear my N95 when I'm when I'm on service in the hospital. I'm wearing it, my mask 12 hours a day. And so that's the new reality. And I've taken care of patients with COVID up close. I've seen it up close, and it's the real deal. It's scary. People are coming in really, really sick, and it's unlike anything that we've seen before. So it is a real threat, and it is something that also is disproportionately affecting our black and brown neighbors.
Mm,
That's the truth of it. And I know that, I mean, of course, that I'm down at Grady, so I'm not exactly seeing the widest range socioeconomically of people, but still, I mean, all the data across the country, Georgia included, shows that it's really disproportionately affecting um, communities of color.
wow. I
Yeah.
mean, first and foremost, I want to thank you for, being on the front line fighting the
Oh yeah, I mean,
virus.
it's the job, right? It's what we signed up for, and I appreciate all the gesture, and I've gotten a lot of emails and texts and stuff over the weeks, but this is what I signed up for. This is like what I went into the field for. But yeah, certainly I appreciate it because it is a risk for my family and people that I love, and this is our basement right now, so I have to come in every day through the basement. I strip my clothes and I hop right in the shower before I see anybody. But so outside of those kind of tedious precautions, um, as long as you wash your hands, do the things they say, wash your hands, avoid touching your face, wear your mask. Like the risk of catching COVID really is pretty low. So that plus proximity and time spent in a public space are factors that can increase your risk of catching the virus. Yeah.
Yeah. And so then, just hopping into the topic at hand today, we would kind of want to continue the discussion, right? As Asian Americans, and specifically as Asian American Christians, like what can we be doing to help our Black brothers and sisters? How can we become allies? And you know, the first question I want to ask in regards
Mm-hmm.
to that is, what do you feel like the response of the Asian American church has been to like all the things that we've been seeing? And do you feel like it's been an adequate response, or are there things that you would change about it?
Yeah, a little bit of background about me is I grew up in Atlanta. We moved here from Illinois when I was like 4 or 5, and so from 5 through high school, I was in Atlanta. I went to a church in Duluth, KCPC or Yanap, and the church was good to me. I'm one of maybe the few, I feel like, that actually had a wonderful experience in the church, and it was a place where I came to know the Lord, and it was a very formative time for me. College was even more formative, and a time when Jesus really became real to my life, and in ways that I wanted to surrender my life, in my career in a way that aligned with what Christ, really speaks. How he what he says, throughout Scripture in the Gospels, and what he says about how we should live and how we should love our neighbors. So, yeah, I mean, I grew up in the church, and specifically the Korean church, and so and like I said, because I've had a great experience in it, I love the Korean church. I'm not a part of it today, and I think, and I'm happy to share about that too, but not because I have some kind of beef with it, or have rejected it, or have rejected the Gospels in any way. I mean, I'm still a Christian, and I love God, and I'm still living in that kind of surrender, or I hope I am. And so I think when it comes to, to your question around like the issue of what our Korean American church response has been around issues of justice or injustice, specifically around matters of race and ethnicity, inequity. And I don't think anybody would be surprised by this, but I think it's been silence. And I think that silence has been for not just one. I mean, it's not a simple, like, we've just been quiet and that's it. And I think the implication when we say we've been silent is that it's because we have been apathetic or indifferent. I don't think it's just that. I think part of it is that. Part of it is where we've had church. Most of our Korean churches, especially in Atlanta, are in the suburbs, and so we're sort of disconnected from the reality of a lot of people in Atlanta. I remember, I distinctly remember when the first year Eileen and I, my wife, we were living in Chicago, and we were living in the city, and a lot more diverse than any place that we had lived in the suburbs of Atlanta. And I remember thinking, wow. And at the time, my parents were living in Alpharetta. I remember thinking, wow, like you can drive through Alpharetta and not see a single person who's homeless, not see a single person who's panhandling for money or for food, right? And so if you grow up in that environment year after year in Alpharetta, right, if that's your reality, then I could see how you might think that, well, Atlanta's fine. Like, we're fine. There's not a whole lot of poverty here. There's not a whole lot of injustice here. I mean, people Most people have homes, most people have cars, they're doing their thing. And so that actually kind of creates a almost like pseudo reality of your city. But I drive downtown every day. I'm going into Grady, and it's a completely different reality from what I grew up living. And so I think part of the silence is just a disconnection, along with, I think there's definitely been some apathy or indifference. And I think if we dig deeper, right, and look at that question from a cultural lens as Koreans, right? Personally, I think there's two things that come to mind. I always think about this. One, I think we have this aversion as Korean Americans of being wrong. And I think it might be related to like this pressure of being right, of doing well academically, of being successful. But I think we have this aversion, I know I do, of being wrong or looking like a fool, speaking too soon, being too hasty with the decision. And so we like to, when we hear about a problem, kind of sit back, take our time, be pragmatic, not be too rushed to make a judgment. We want to be balanced about it, especially around kind of really serious issues of justice. And so I think we have this tendency, we want to wait until there's like conclusive evidence that this is wrong. And then we'll be like, oh yeah, that's wrong, and we'll speak out. And then secondly, I think, if for people who don't understand Korean American culture, I think they could look at us and say, oh, you guys are just quiet by nature. But David, I know, like having just met you, I can just say like I know, we're not a quiet people, right? We're a hierarchical people, and so I think there's this kind of cultural hierarchy that we have where we defer to someone older than us. If I'm in the presence of someone older than me, my assumption is they know more about life than I do. They're smarter than me for that reason. And my opinion about something, whatever it is secondary to their opinion. And so I'm quiet in that space, right? When someone older than me, has an opinion about whatever issue we're talking about. And then when in a different scenario, when I'm the older one, now that's my turn to talk, right? Like now I have the authority culturally to say, this is what it is, this is my opinion, in my inferences, that's your opinion too, younger person, right? And don't try to challenge me, right? That's disrespectful if you try to challenge me, because I know more about life than you do, even though I'm only a year older. It can be, even if you're only like a few months older than somebody, there's still that hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
And I think that can be a good thing, but it can also be problematic in that when we're outside of our own culture, then we kind of act through the same lens, right? When we come around someone with some authority, whether it's a boss or like, I don't know, someone older than us who has a higher position or a higher title than us, let's say even like a pastor or a leader in the church, right? We then kind of take that, like we have that cultural submission built in and we stay quiet. And so I think there are a lot of reasons why our response has been silence. But I know, and again, maybe part of it is apathy and indifference. Maybe I'm downplaying that, but I do think a big piece of it is that it's a complicated reason, but I don't think it's because, at least especially these days, I don't think it's because Korean Americans aren't thinking about this issue. I think, we're integrated into this society. We're savvy with social media. We read the news. We speak English well. We understand English well. We're culturally American in a lot of ways. And so we're paying attention. And the question is, when we look at our institutions, specifically the church, I don't know if there's been a whole lot of leadership in terms of stepping out and trying to engage in these issues. Because one other piece of this is too is like we're still pretty, for the Korean American church is still pretty new in this country, especially in our city in Atlanta. I would say that maybe we're 2 generations in of churches, right? We might have like our parents, and I say that as like a 36-year-old father, right? But our parents' generation, we had that church. and then like the EM, right? The
Right.
EM generation, and then like that's it, right? There's not really like a great grandparents church, Korean American church in the city, or a grandparents church, right? It's like our parents, which is kind of the catch-all for everybody older than us, and then us who are more culturally American, and speak English fluently. And so sometimes we might get caught up and think like there's a precedent for what we do, but really when you look at it objectively, like there is no precedent. Like we're still figuring out what being a Korean American Christian is in the city. We're still figuring out what a Korean American church looks like, what that identity is. And I have conversations with this all the time with my other, friends who are pastors. We wrestle with this. Like, what does it mean to be a Korean American Christian? Like, in terms of like hard, objective identity metrics. When you close your eyes and you walk into any Korean American church in the city, can you like, are there cultural markers that would point to you, that would inform you to the extent that, oh yeah, this is a Korean church? Like, I don't know if we have all that figured out yet,
Because
and that's not to like cast judgment on it. Yeah.
and if you walk into a black church and you have your
Mm-hmm.
eyes closed, there are things that culturally signal, oh, I'm in a
Right.
black church or white church. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. And in Latino church, Latinx church, like in terms of the songs they sing, even like the order of worship, the sermon style, the sermon length, like all these kind of things, I would say, and maybe some people would push back, but I think that in a lot of ways we resemble the white church, right? If you were to close your eyes and hop into, the average Korean American church in the city, and not just Atlanta, but across the country, I don't know if there would be a lot of distinctions from a white church, right? We favor Hillsong, we favor Passion, we go to Passion, we want to go to Hillsong in Australia to learn how to lead worship. Like we that's embedded in our culture now. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I think we also have to realize that we didn't like this culture is, first, it's new and it's not necessarily from us. And so I think it's kind of important to highlight some of those things, because it's not just the style of worship, but it's also the theology that comes with it, right? And how we view the Gospels, and how we exegete, the exegesis from the text, how that matters to us, and how that the application of the Gospels and Scripture in our lives, like all that is derived not necessarily from what it means to be Korean and Christian, but perhaps Korean American in a white context and Christian.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've been silent. The long answer to your question is we've been silent. Yeah.
Yeah, but I really appreciate you talking about our culture and what the silence can mean, because
Mm-hmm.
perception-wise, like someone looking from the outside in might think, oh, Korean Americans are being silent because they don't care. If they don't have the
Mm-hmm.
context of knowing kind of our cultural background, that's a very easy conclusion to get to.
Yeah.
And I think it's important that we vocalize what our culture is so that people don't get that misconception. But at the same time, I think it's important that we are aware that that's how it's being perceived,
Mm-hmm.
because we definitely don't want to be people who brush off social injustices and say, well, it doesn't matter to us, so we're not going to care about it.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, Korean people are an oppressed people.
Yes.
If you think about like South Korea, the occupation of the Japanese army and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So if there is a minority group in America that can understand oppression and relate to it, and want to speak out against it, I think it's us.
I completely agree. And what the interesting part about that, what you just said, is I don't remember ever talking about our oppression as a people in the church growing up. I don't ever remember having any conversation about that. It was almost like that was erased from our history. Like it was something, maybe it was too painful for our parents to look at and acknowledge and say, like, what do we learn from this? How can we be better? What baggage do we carry from this? I think in a lot of ways we kind of brushed it under the rug, and that's another kind of cultural phenomenon of Koreans too. It's and I've been hearing these stories more and more about like people, you know, other like Korean brothers and sisters who grew up in the most abusive or neglectful homes, and yet their parents would put on this, you know, they would put the dirty van in the garage on Sunday, and they would bring out the shiny Lexus and drive that to church, and present this image or facade that like everything is fine, my family is fine, like we're blessed, we're good, God is good in us. But then come the next day, like it's a kind of same brokenness that just doesn't. So I don't know culturally we ever healed from those things that we had before, and instead we try to like not acknowledge it, try to forget it, kind of cleave it, cut it off from our history, and start fresh in this land of opportunity. And so I think that part of the part of the problem is like we got disconnected from our own story, because like you said, we know what it's like to have, you know, systemic injustice thrown onto our people in the form of murder and rape and pillaging, and, you know, and not to mention educational and economic disadvantage, right? All that was stripped from us because we were devalued systemically as a people. We were told we were inferior, uglier, dumber, less than. And so that's why we have this sort of, you know, cultural rage too, right? Like when you get pushed down like that, generation after generation, when you see people who you love, who are murdered for no reason or raped, you know, inexplicably, it generates a rage, and so we have that, right? Like we have that kind of phenomenon in us, and so I think if anybody should understand, at least put in the context, I'm not saying it's right, but put in the context why lootings would happen in the midst of protest. Like we should understand that, right?
Yeah.
We should understand what it's like to just say, F it, like you've done enough to me already. I'm going to burn this down, right? Like I think, you know, we kind of have like that. So I'm not saying like other groups can understand that, but I think if the more connected we are to our history, the more we can understand that. So I don't know the reasons why we don't talk, why we're so disconnected from our history, but I can only, you know, estimate or guess why. But the fact of the matter is that we have been.
And just to give context to the listener a little bit, some of the things that I mean, because one thing that a lot of people don't know is originally the English spelling of Korea started with a C. But the reason why it changed to a K is because during the Japanese occupation, Japan said, we don't like the fact that Korea comes before us. So we're going to change it to a K so that they're after us. So
wow. Yeah, I forgot about that. Wow.
Yeah, even small, like, I mean, seemingly small, but really profound things have been done to us to oppress us. And like we were talking about, the rage and the lashing out, like that's happened in our history too. The assassination at, I forget the name of the train station, but there was Korean rebels carried out an assassination of a leader in the Japanese army. And I remember there was a really like chilling quote by the mother of the person that carried out the assassination, and it was almost, she was pretty much condoning the said violence. And from the outside perspective, it can be like, how can a mother condone her son killing another human being? But if you understand that rage and that kind of desperation of trying to break out of bondage, then you're like, okay, that makes complete sense.
Right.
And
right.
One thing I want to kind of bring to the attention of the listeners here is this is something that Andy Yun of the Nabi Design podcast says a lot.
Yeah, he's a historian, right?
Yeah.
He's a kind of our living historian here.
Yeah, he likes to say this. He says, you know, Black people have Martin Luther King Jr. The Indian people, when oppressed by the British, had Gandhi, and he said, Koreans don't realize we have our own civil rights leader, pioneer, which was An Chang-ho,
That's
or
right.
his pen name, Tosan. So like if you want to get reconnected to that, I would suggest that you start there. Look up An Chang-ho, see all the things that he did, and you'll be surprised to see how he's influenced civil rights movements globally, not just in Korea.
Right.
So, but
Mm-hmm.
I do. I really do think that Korean Americans have the capacity. Obviously, not at the same level, especially because we aren't really oppressed anymore. We got our own country back. The same level of oppression that Black people still live through today, we don't live through that. So it's not at the same level, but I think we can be sympathetic towards that because it's in our DNA. It's kind of
Yeah.
woven into our history. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what I would say too is that, I think certainly the nature of the oppression looks different. But I would still say that we encounter racism here, and just, real quick, when I say racism, so there's kind of like terminology, right? Racism is about power. And so that, like, when I say racism, I automatically think power, and I think power differential, like who has power. And so racism is a bit different from prejudice. Prejudice is when you have a belief or attitude about another group of people that's unfounded. You prejudge them that way without knowing them, right? Whether it's true or not. And so people of color, like minorities, can be prejudiced against each other, but it's very difficult to be racist because the power differential isn't always clear there, right? Power. So racism is power plus prejudice. It's when you have prejudice and you have the power to enact policies to live out that prejudice, right? So whether it's we have so many examples in U.S. history, right? Whether it's after Reconstruction, the Jim Crow laws where they said separate but equal, like that's racism acting on prejudice, and so that the implications there was Black people could not buy homes in certain neighborhoods. There was redlining. They couldn't, which meant they had less access to better schools, better jobs, better economic opportunities and jobs, so on and so forth. And so racism is about power. And so what I would say is certainly the oppression that we've experienced as Korean Americans or Asian Americans in this country looks different than African Americans, for sure. We weren't brought here on ships in 1619, 400 years ago. We didn't have a civil war that was fought and then have a nice period of Reconstruction and then go into Jim Crow. Like, that's not our history. But certainly there are some parallels in the sense that we have been told through policies, again, racist practices, that we don't belong here. And so a lot of people forget the Chinese Exclusion Act of, I think it was like 1882, 1883. But that was a bill that was passed on a federal level banning Chinese people from immigrating or becoming naturalized citizens. And then I think in like the 1920s, after World War I started, that act expanded to include all Asians, not just Chinese people. So that includes us, that includes people from Japan, every Asian country. So that was like a literal legislative, that was a policy that went through that said, you are a foreigner forever. Like, you are not going to be a citizen here. You can live here if you already do, but you don't belong here, right? And so we kind of hear this like term like perpetual foreigner, like that's where that comes from. Like, it was not just an idea that popped up because we experienced racism from a random person growing up, but like that was a bill that was passed to tell us we're like, when it comes to what being American means, that's not us. And so Black people understand that too. They that's the essence of one of the key pillars of what it means to be on the wrong side of racism in this country, to be made to feel like you don't belong here, your life doesn't matter as much, what you care about doesn't really matter in the mainstream conversation. So yeah, I mean, we're not but you know, you can look through history and even say like, wow, we've actually experienced lynching too, like, or at least Asian Americans have. I think, I forgot when the date was, but the single greatest lynching in terms of numbers of people who were killed happened in San Francisco against Chinese immigrants. I think in the 19th century. So I think over like 50 people were killed in one day. And so, you know, our people have experienced similar things, not to the same endemic nature, but, you know, again, we're kind of disconnected from these stories. And so when you grow up in a church and everything is about like personalizing the gospel, and everything is about like your personal devotion, which are great things, but you're not hearing the meta narrative of like where we came from, like what we had to overcome to love the Lord, and like what it cost us to be devoted, like all those things. When you don't get that kind of teaching, then you start to think, man, like we're good, like we're fine in this country, you know, like we have nothing to complain about because I got my house in the suburbs, I go to a great church, I have my community, I got my restaurants, I got my car, I got my job, like everything's good. But again, like being disconnected from our history, it's kind of a lie in a way, you know.
Yeah. And another interesting caveat to that is when we hear things like the Chinese Exclusion Act or the internment of Japanese people, a lot of times Korean
Mm-hmm.
Americans say, well, that's not us. Like, we're
Mm-hmm.
privileged to know where our country of origin is, right? We know exactly where we came from. We know our lineage. If you really research your last name, like there's ways to figure out like what your ancestry is. So we
Right.
kind of have these pockets of Asian Americans, even though most of white America probably sees us as one group. Um, so I think that also kind of damages the um, kind of our identity. It has a detrimental effect to our identity as Asian Americans. Like,
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
we say, well, that's happening to outsiders, so we don't have to worry about it, not
Right.
realizing that it actually, is happening to us. Like it is our,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Um,
Right.
I,
And you're right. I mean, oh yeah, go ahead.
no, no, go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, we as Koreans are incredibly proud as Asians. Like, you know that we're probably the proudest. I don't know why, but maybe it's just because like all the crap we had to go through and survive in our history. But yeah, we're very proud people, and so we think, man, we're very different from every other Asian. But to the outsider, no, we're not. You
Yeah.
know, I can't tell you how many times people called me Chinese or Japanese growing up, but then they would never guess Korean, right? So to the non-Korean person, the non-Asian person, we're all the same. And that matters because we get thrown into the mix, right? So whatever happened to Japanese people, you know, in the 1940s in the internment camps, whatever happened to Chinese immigrants in the 19th century, that all can happen to us as well, just like that.
Yeah.
And so I think the other side of this too is, you know, sometimes, or I think not sometimes, but in a lot of ways, we've forgotten the ways in which our, you know, interests as Asian Americans in this country were actually very much aligned with African American in their fight for civil rights.
Mm.
And so that's really important to acknowledge as well, because especially when you think about how in a lot of ways the relationship between the African American and Asian American community, specifically Korean American community, is very tense at times. It can be very, very tense. And there's a lot of reason for that. But I think when we focus on that tension, we also forget the fact that, wow, there were actually really pivotal moments in our history when we were aligned. And my favorite example, and it was recently discussed in a podcast that was posted by the Atlanta Asian American Christian Collective. But it was this conversation between some people who I really admire. They were talking specifically about Black American and Asian American relationships and like that racial tension and like what does reconciliation look like. And apparently, you know, there, after World War II ended, there was this bill that came up that was pushing for reparations for Japanese Americans because they had been unfairly put, unjustly, imprisoned in internment camps. And so there was actually some momentum to support reparations for these people who were, imprisoned in these camps. And the bill came down to, I think, 1 or 2 votes, but it passed with the support of one of the few Black congressmen. It was a Black man who ended up supporting reparations. And so that bill would never have passed if it wasn't for his support. And the tragic thing about that is, right, Japanese Americans got reparations because of that bill, because it passed with the support of that Black congressman. But no reparations have been ever given for African Americans. So in that moment, it was like a beautiful thing, but also a really tragic thing where you had a lot of African Americans in that time saying, like, what? Like, how can they get reparations for 5, 10, 10 years of being in prison? What about our 400 years of being enslaved? Like, where are the reparations there? So I mean, I think that was both like a beautiful moment, but also a tragedy. You could look at it as, man, that was a great moment of solidarity, but it's also like a wedge, right? Now that kind of puts Black Americans and Asian Americans on opposite sides to say, like, well, you got reparations. What about, are you going to come support us now? So, I think we need to have more conversations about kind of those moments when things were aligned, because, the myth of the model minority, one of the big problems with it is that it puts us as the successful minority. It kind of pitches us against other people of color, specifically African Americans, right?
So, man, that's so good. But before we move on to the next question, I was gonna ask. I wanted to turn the wheel back a little bit and go back to something that you mentioned. One thing that I struggle, as a Christian, a Korean American Christian, is when I do see the riots, I do feel in my heart, like, if something like this were happening to my family, to my community, I would probably be out there, causing havoc too. Like, I would want to burn down everything if, my brother were gunned down for no reason, or someone had put their knee on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds until he, died from not being able to breathe. So I get the human part of that, and I get the rage, and I can understand it. But as a Christian who is called to, love all your neighbors, that includes, the people who own those small businesses, or like whatever it may be. Like, is there a way to reconcile the kind of the righteous anger and the rage that you feel with the want to keep peace? Like, do you think there's a way to kind of reconcile those two?
I mean, it's a really tough issue, and I think maybe it's our human nature. But when we see the news, there's something fear invoking about hearing about a protest. When you hear about a lot of people getting together, angry, raising their voices in solidarity towards some cause, that raises people's eyebrows, and that's why protest is a powerful form of voicing dissent. And so maybe it's our human nature that when we hear about the really kind of negative side of protesting, the rioting and looting, the people who are taking advantage of that situation and taking advantage of a vulnerable part of society, it makes us, that, I can't get behind this cause now. Like, I can't put my name behind that. And so so there's like this tension there, and I'm not, and I certainly am not saying that I don't think anybody is condoning this, and I don't think any protester who has that righteous anger, who wants justice, not just for George Floyd's family, not just for Ahmaud Arbery's family, but for all Black Americans, right? Who wants justice, who wants a system that guarantees justice, that is just from the start. I don't think that anybody there wants to see destruction. right? I think it's more of, I understand the destruction. I understand because that comes from pain. And I think one really important thing that we have, that I didn't even realize until a few weeks ago, talking with some of my African American friends about George Floyd. A colleague of mine at Grady, what she said was, the first reaction when I saw that video, it wasn't shock and anger. For me, I was like, man, I was shocked, and then I was pissed, and then I was like, what are we gonna do about it? And she was like, for me, it wasn't shock and anger. It was exhaustion, and it was grief, right? So it was like this like, oh my gosh, like not again, like this like shoulder slumping, like defeat, kind of like the breath taken out of you. And so like think about that. Like if, you know, my reaction of shock and anger, like that, I had the luxury of doing that, right? I had the luxury of being like, oh my gosh, how could this happen? Oh, this can't be right. I'm like so mad at this. But for people whose lived experience is that reality, not just for this generation, not just in the last 10 years, but I mean, for 400 years, to see another one fall like that, another person, like, this colleague, this friend said, I felt like I grieved like I had lost my own son. And so like that kind of pain and mourning in a human being, right? So you're gonna see brokenness from that. You're gonna see a broken response from that. And so I think as much as we who are untouched by this directly, at least, can have the grace to see that, in our Black and brown brothers and sisters who are hurting, to have the grace to see that. I mean, as difficult as that is, especially if it's your store that gets destroyed, right? I can't ask that of any other Korean American person. But I would hope that that God's grace would grow in me to have those eyes of compassion and understanding and patience, to not only express that righteous anger, but also to have that extra measure of grace and extend that grace, because it's all pain, it's all trauma, it's all injustice that has not gotten better at all over the years. Racism is no different. It's just better hidden, right? And there's that phrase that's come out where it's not that more of these, more police are committing these senseless acts of violence or killings. It's just being filmed, right? I think like Will Smith is credited for saying that. So, and it's not, none of this is to say like all police are bad, and I don't think anybody, it's just, we need justice, and we need a system that guarantees justice and holds people accountable who are in power to maintain those systems of justice. And that's just not the reality, right? So, there's no easy answer to that question of like, how do we reconcile, like, oh man, I get it, but looting is wrong. There's no easy answer there, but you have to find some way to have grace and that righteous anger for justice at the same time. Yeah. And not like having those two things does not excuse what is wrong. It doesn't say like, that's okay, like go ahead and loot Target. Like, no, that's not what anybody is saying, but it's saying like, it's pain, right? It's pain. Like, can we understand that it's pain? Right. It's raw hurt and pain.
Yeah. And I think this is something that I talked with my pastor on, Pastor John, who was on, well, I think it would be 2 episodes ago. One thing that
great guy.
One thing that we kind of came to was, like, because he's my pastor, so we're just talking all the time. One thing we said was, we can understand we can show grace, we can understand the righteous anger, but the text in a lot of ways is the living word, and it's personal to you. Like when you read the Bible and you take it as, oh, based on this person needs to change, you're reading it wrong. If you read the Bible and say, wow, I need to change, that's when you're like really effectively reading the Bible in the proper way, right? So the conclusion that we kind of came to was, we definitely show compassion, sympathy for what's happening to the Black community, and we stand with them. But whenever a situation were to happen to Korean Americans, we should strive to uphold peace. Because I think that was really the only way that we could like reconcile the two. Just
Mm.
use your convictions as a Christian as a personal conviction. Um, we're not meant to be judges, right? God never said, "I'm giving you the Holy Spirit so that you can judge others." It's we're meant to show love first and foremost. So in that way, we said maybe the best way is to simply say, man, we really understand you guys, but for us personally, we strive to uphold peace for us personally whenever we can. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that?
Yeah. And I, I don't certainly don't disagree with the notion of being a peacekeeper. I think the way that that is manifested or actualized is quite, there's a spectrum, right? Because on one hand, keeping the peace is no conflict, but no conflict does not equal peace, right? No conflict means a system of potentially of injustice is maintained, right? So in that sense, no conflict means let me live my life. Let me live my life normally. And so I agree we need to be peacemakers, but to get to that point is going to require some change, in my opinion, and because right now, again, for the past 400 years, there has been no peace, right? There is no peace without justice, and there can be no reconciliation without justice before that. We can't skip to reconciliation and forgiveness without a deliberate intention for justice. And so I totally agree that we are called to be peacemakers, but I also say that, I think the Bible is clear about what justice looks like. I think there are moments over and over through the narrative text of scripture, like of what justice is. You can look in Isaiah 58, Micah 6:8. Even in the gospel, they kind of touch on what justice looks like in the Sermon on the Mount. So we have those examples of what justice looks like for the oppressed, and how we are called out to stand up on behalf or stand with those who are oppressed. Like, that's not a question, that's not a debated thing in scripture. And so I think the question is then, like, how, as peacemakers, do we work towards standing with the oppressed? What does that look like? And so I don't think that, and this is my opinion, right? Like, I don't think that no conflict is the same as peace, especially in this situation, because again, no conflict as it pertains to Korean Americans who are, middle class, upper middle class, means we just want things to quiet down. We don't want conflict on the news. We don't want any more people dying, any more buildings destroyed. But that doesn't change the system that led to those things in the first place. So, like I said, peace for sure. How we get there, that's a dialogue we need to have openly as a church, right?
Yeah, and I'm grateful for people like Martin Luther King Jr., who kind of modeled for us how to peacefully do certain things. And again, in his peaceful protest, there were definitely conflicts, right? Like,
right.
People were hosed down. They were, guard dogs were like let loose on them, and it wasn't an easy road. A lot of people, when they think about like the Montgomery bus boycott, they think it happened overnight. Like, oh, like these black people are serious, so we should, like, it took months of
I think it was
boycotting.
like 375 days.
Yeah,
370 plus days, over a year.
Yeah.
Imagine like walking to work every day.
Exactly.
For over a year, rainer, in the Alabama heat, right, in the humidity of Alabama. So yeah, I mean, to your point, they protested peacefully, and I think, like, man, that is as wrong as they have been, to have such a love and dedication to the gospel about peace, being peacemakers, to protest in that way. That is like that gives me chills every time I think about it, because they had every right? They had that Han to just go out and burn everything up.
Yeah.
And yet the gospel had worked in such a way where it said, no, like, you get punched in the face, you turn the other cheek,
Yeah.
right? Luke 6, I think it's Luke 6, where it's like, isn't it easy to love those who love you, right? But how much harder is it to love those who to openly hate you, right? Like,
Yeah.
that kind of call, like, that can come from nowhere else but the gospel. And so that cannot come from a secular view. It just doesn't make, like, it just does not, it cannot take hold in a widespread in a community of people, maybe a handful of people, like, who are kind of exceptional, but like, that kind of ethic to respond with peace can only come if the gospel has really touched a whole community of people. And so that's just an example for us, right? And you're right, like, people spit on them, they yelled at them, they blew up churches, they tried to kill his family. And so it was like, just because they protested peacefully does not mean that there was an absence of conflict in what they did. And so I think that's a great example to look at in terms of like what we can do, right? Because I think we might confuse, as Korean Americans, peace with no conflict, because we just want people to get along. Like, we've tasted success in this country. We want, like, we kind of want to model that in a way, but again, that's kind of that model minority myth, right? So like, but because we've tasted it, we want to say like, hey, like, just keep your head down, do your thing, it'll come your way. But it hasn't come their way, and frankly, it won't come their way unless we kind of galvanize together and stand up together.
Yeah, and I think if people take what we just talked about and say, well, that's the only correct way to protest, and they use that to undermine the protests that are happening now, because overwhelmingly the protests are peaceful. They're just not on the news. Just the really bad parts are on the news. So our perception is that most of the protests are, violent. They're not, right? So if that's the way that you're taking this, I want you to know that that's not what we're saying at all. We're not saying that, the way that Martin Luther King did it, like, that should be an example. That should be something that we should look at and say, wow, that is amazing. That is just mind-boggling that he was able to galvanize an entire community to act in that loving way. But if we were to see an outlash of righteous anger, like, we don't then say, oh, that person's wrong and the entire movement is undermined. We turn to, man, we really feel for them. Like, we try to understand why they are behaving that way so that we can sympathize and empathize. So I just want to make that clear for anybody thinking that what we're saying is there's only one right way to protest. That's the model that we strive for.
I mean, and kind of.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. No, finish. Yeah.
No, I was gonna say.
Well, just
whenever
piggyback.
we see, whenever we see people lash out, and because a lot of this is just frustration and not knowing what to do, right? They're like you were saying, a lot of them don't have the power to change policy. So it's just a physical outlash. So we should, definitely just strive to understand and stand with them.
Yeah, and what I was gonna say is just like kind of piggybacking off that sense of like, wow, the fact that people can even protest peacefully in the midst of what's happened to them, or in response to what's happened to them, in response to what little change there has been, at least in the narrative of Black Americans being treated and perceived as less than, white Americans. I think that's why, like, that's the context for why MLK always said, who really hurt us the most were those moderate Christians. Because if anybody was in the most comfortable position and who had the greatest privilege and luxury to engage and stand with us, it was the moderate Christian. So to be frank, I think in a lot of ways, the ways in which God has blessed the Korean American church, like, we are now that moderate Christian. And so that call is directly, I think I want to say it's directly to us, because we have this privilege. We can step in, we can stand with, we can engage, even though no cost has been to us. The gospel is one of the, I mean, I'm not going to say like, you know, I'm not going to try to be super dogmatic, but the gospel was one of the the things that in this world that tell like that rationalizes standing up for your neighbor when there's no interest of you.
Yeah.
Like maybe there are other religions that say that, I don't know, but I know the gospel is one of the few religions in this world that says you should lay your life down. Philippians 2, like your neighbor is above yourself. Like hold your neighbor above yourself. There, like that doesn't make sense in a secular sense. Like why would you do that? What ethic is there? Why would you give your life for your neighbor? Right? So that call is really written in the gospel. And then the other thing that we should be exceptional at, and this is in the podcast or one of the Zoom meetings that I saw recently, and I'm going to give credit to Dr. Christina Edmondson. She said that if the church can do anything well, it should be that we should repent well. Like we should be the best at repenting. So repenting and loving your neighbor, like we should be the best at. Of anybody in this country, we should be the best at. And so we are that moderate Christian now, and we are kind of at this critical inflection point in our history where if we do not engage 20 years from now, or maybe 10 years from now, they're going to look back on the Korean American church and say, why were you quiet? Why were you silent? Right? And like we said earlier, that's a complicated thing. It's not as simple as like we're indifferent, but the inaction is going to be interpreted as indifference, for better or for worse.
For sure. And again, we need to be aware of that perception because we don't want to be out there spreading a message that we don't agree with. And so I think the reality, I think perceived reality a lot of times is as important as actual reality because to the person receiving it, there's no difference.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I'm sorry, do you have like a time limit or are you okay?
No. Like I'm good. This is good.
Okay.
Yeah.
So because we're almost at the hour mark, but I feel like we still need to cover a few more things. So
Sure.
question I want to then ask, kind of having gone through like our kind of cultural background and kind of what we're seeing right now, what do you think Korean American churches, or maybe even just Korean American Christians, can be doing better to be allies and to stand with our Black American brothers and sisters?
Yeah. I think the first thing we got to do is listen, and that is not an easy thing to do. And by listening, I don't mean just hear what's being said or stay up to date on social media or the news. Like that's not listening. But like listening is a part of listening is like opening your heart, and opening your heart is a vulnerable thing to do, because when you do that, that means you are willing to have your opinion be changed. That is very vulnerable to feel. Like that's like being on shaky ground. It's very unsettling to open yourself up to say, I'm actually going to listen and listen, like not just hear, but like listen. And so I think we have to pray that we kind of have that posture of listening, because if this doesn't hit us on a heart level, if you just try to engage with this on an intellectual level just because of what you read on social media, that's not going to sustain any long-term effort. This has to hit you in the heart and anger you on a visceral level, and the injustice has to be unacceptable on a visceral level for us to commit long-term to this. And so I think the first step is listen, and one really practical, tangible way to do that is to be in relationship with people of different perspectives, especially African Americans. So if you don't get this, right, if none of this makes sense to you, like if for the listener, if you're a person who like up until this point was like, I don't think any of this is like legit, but you're willing to listen, I think it's a great first step, right? And so by listening, you're actually entering in that conversation with someone without judgment, without like, I already have my mind made up about this. what's changed my heart about this, and what kind of always fires me up, is when I hear these stories about, directly from people about what it's like. Because when you hear those stories, it's like, man, this is not like some theory. This is not some like media, infiltration. Like, this is not fake news, right? We blame the media for everything we don't like to hear about, but like, when you hear these stories from people themselves, like it's real. Like, the pain is real. And so listening is a first step. A great practical way to do that is to be in relationship. And so I'm not saying like go tokenize somebody. Don't say like, hey, you want to be my black friend? Like that's not the same thing, right? But if you don't have, if you I mean, sidebar, but like, if you don't have anybody in your network who is black, then I think that's a problem there, right? And I'm not trying to like cast judgment or anything like that, but like, maybe that's why one has the perspective they have if they're not in actual relationship. So again, I can live in Alpharetta for 10 years and not think that there are any problems in Atlanta.
Yeah.
It's not, there's a proximity component to listening. And then secondly, I think, and this is one thing that actually we do well in the Korean American churches, is repent. I think we are a prideful people, but I also think that we can repent when it's needed. And we can repent for our sin when that conviction hits. And so I think that's step 2, is to repent for our inaction, maybe some self-absorption, maybe some, on balance, like, I think the relationship, again, at times between African Americans and Asian Americans can be really tense for good reason. I think there is a mixed bag there, but in order to get to reconciliation, we got to repent, right? We got to be the first to say sorry. We have to be willing to come to the table to say, like, we were wrong, like, we've done some wrong things, and we're really sorry for that. So I think second thing is repent. And then the third thing is, we have to keep talking about it in circles, in situations like this, right? This is something that can't go away. So that kind of obviates itself. I think a fourth thing is to realize the existing opportunities that we have for healing. And so my friends know this. I've talked about this like over and over again. But for whatever reason, when Koreans migrated to America, we set up businesses, dry cleaners, yes, and some restaurants, yes, but we also set up a lot of businesses that are kind of catered towards the African American community, right? I don't know where that came from. I don't know why it became so widespread. It wasn't illegal. We did this legally, but when you step back and look at it, right, like, what business do we really have in these communities? It's not wrong, but I think, as a thought experiment, like, let's say we're in Korea and we're living in a poor part of Seoul, and a bunch of Swedes come over from Sweden, and they set up a shop. I don't know, that's something like catered towards us. Maybe it's like eyelid surgery. like they set up these eyelid surgery clinics, okay? And they start off poor like us, and then over 10 years, over 20 years, and 30 years, we can see like, oh man, they're kind of making money, like they're doing well. And we're, we like this business, we're patronizing them. The cars are getting nicer, their clothes are getting nicer, and we keep patronizing their restaurants or their businesses, and they're not really paying attention to us. They're not really helping us out here, and we're still poor, right? Again, none of that is illegal, but I would feel some type of way about that. I'd be like, man, like, we're actually like helping your life tremendously, but can you help us out? Like, can you at least engage with us and help us out in some way? So I think that, a lot of the tension happens because Korean people, we live by the law. We say, I have a business here, I'm legally here. My business is to sell goods to you. I'm not making you buy it. You come in the store, you're buying it, fine. And that's it. That's my obligation to you. But I actually think that as believers, we should engage with our communities that we do business in. And I think that's a very, very like ripe opportunity for healing. Like, what would it look like for a beauty supply store in South Atlanta to put up a Black Lives Matter sign and say, we stand with you. We're wrong for disengaging this whole time, even though we've sold our products to you for a long time. We were wrong for that, but we want to change that narrative, right? Like, man, I just like, oh, that would wreck me, because that would be so incredibly healing. Like that, it's not going to undo and fix everything, but it would be a very unexpected gesture that for the African American community, if our Korean parents took that perspective, right? That would be a beautiful thing, and we can do that. So I think there are actually a lot of ways that we can engage that don't necessarily mean that we're protesting in the streets. I think we should do that if we feel compelled to do that, but there are other meaningful ways for us to stand with the Black community in this city in the short term that can be very, very meaningful. And a lot of our parents, a lot of our folks who have these businesses, they go to church. We know that.
Yeah. Just to kind of elaborate on the lack of engagement of Korean American businesses to the Black community, that's actually one of the reasons the LA riots happened. So one thing that a lot of people don't realize is they think it's just the riots happened because of the Rodney King verdict. And they criticized the riots because it disproportionately affected Korean American businesses when their target should have been white people. One thing that those people don't realize is the tensions between Korean Americans and the Black community were already pretty, they weren't good, because exactly what you're talking about. These foreigners are moving in. And I actually think the reason why Koreans set up businesses in those areas is because it's just cheaper rent, right? Like Koreans being poor just didn't have any other option.
Yeah.
But in that, like you were saying, Korean Americans, they're making a lot of money, and honestly, not even really giving back to the community, right? In terms of helping like property value or anything like that. Because whenever we got the money, we would go to the white neighborhoods because we want to live in the affluent areas, even though we're getting money from the kind of poorer areas. So the tension was already there, and when things popped off, it was just that anger, that anger was already there anyways. That's what really incited the riots and the whole rooftop Korean like story and all that. So I totally agree. The engagement in the community is great, and I want to bring it back to a story that you told on the KTL podcast of how you kind of feel like you want to show gratitude because like your parents as small business owners, the way that you kind of funded, I don't want to say funded, but the way that you kind of came up and became a doctor, a lot of it was indebted to the patronage of people in those communities. And you, I think, mentioned the fact that being at Grady was kind of a full circle, I received and now I'm trying to give back. And I always thought that story was so amazing. And it was just such a beautiful story of recognizing that, there is, that you do see that you had help along the way and you're just trying to give that help back.
Yeah, I mean, I was 8 years old in 1992 when I saw the LA riots on TV. I remember watching with my dad on CNN, being like, what is going on? He had no answer for me. And then, so I had no context for what was happening. I don't think anybody really understood. And then, flash forward several years when I'm in residency, which is the post med school training. When you're a doctor, but you're not like cut loose yet. And that 2014, 2015, I was in training. I was kind of finishing up my training, and the defining statement of my residency was Black Lives Matter. And then it all kind of hit me. Oh my goodness! Like my parents never owned a business selling goods, but they were in insurance, and so they provided insurance for all of these businesses all over Atlanta, right? So I indirectly benefited from that tremendously. And I don't, certainly I had to like kind of work through the guilt of that, but these days I don't feel guilty. I feel like, man, this is a calling that was very specific to me in this time, in this city, that I feel I thrive in, right? I have been blessed tremendously to be able to do this, and man, it's the least I can do. Like it's the very least I can do to express my gratitude and love, and to provide the best care that I can. And so my teams know this. Like I do a lot of teaching in the hospital. They know when I'm on service, like there's no shortcuts with Dr. Sonu. Like there's no shortcuts. We will, and we're operating in a broken system, but my team knows that when I'm on service, like we're going to provide exceptional care, because that is a standard that that is critical for me. Like that I need to maintain that standard. And it's just, and what I love about being at Grady is that doctors who work at Grady all have that attitude. Like they all have that, you don't have to work at Grady. Like the thing about being a doctor is like, you can work anywhere you want. You can, and like the pay scale like fluctuates from 150K to 400, 500K, depending on where you want to work, right? So nobody has to work at Grady, but for those who do, they're mission driven, they're committed to this cause. And so I would love to not be one of the few Asian Americans or one of the few Korean Americans doing internal medicine and pediatrics at Grady. Like I would love to see a flood of believers come in with that kind of same heart. Like, man, I just want to give back. I want to be in the city. I want to be a part of the city. I want to change the narrative, right? And it's just amazing, like how forgiving people are. Because I have this conversation all the time, like if I get to know a patient well enough, I'll be like, man, like I just want to say, like, we've done some wrong. We've been on the wrong side of history in a lot of ways as a people. And it's just amazing how people are like, Doc, don't even worry about it. Like, it's not even you. Like they're so gracious. And so there's no like, and so like that kind of interaction is like it's definitely like a secondary benefit. Like the primary issue is like I got to take care of the person's health problems, but like to have that conversation on the side is like, so that's what gives me that kind of sense of meaning. Like when I drive out of the hospital, I can say, man, like not only did I help treat people's diseases and decompensated heart failure, whatever, I also had a conversation about race that I would never have been able to have had I not been intentionally in this space. So I think that's thank you for sharing that story. But I think for the younger generation, like think about that. Like a lot of I think young people think that like they wonder like what is my story here? Like what significance do I have? And why am I Korean? I don't know if anybody's ever asked them, like, why am I Korean in Atlanta in 2020? Like, there's a reason for that. And I think if you ask that question of like, why, because it's not an accident, right? Like I'm Korean, that you're Korean, like that's not an accident. And God didn't make a mistake when he did that. Like, that's a good thing, right? Us being Korean is a good thing, right? And it is something that God loves, right? So we should not be ashamed to be Korean, and not in a proud way, but also in a way that like we're not just Korean in our church, but we're Korean in this city, and we represent what being Korean means, right? So that's why I say like we're kind of in this together in a way. But for those young people who are kind of wondering like, what's my role here? Well, think about what this means for your future. Like there's ways to kind of bring these things together. And I would not be a Grady doc if I was not completely wrecked and changed by the gospel. Like if I wasn't a Christian and I made it through med school, man, like I would want to make money. Like I would want to make money, and I would want to drive a Tesla and then like have a nice house. Like I know, because I want those things, right? Yeah. So, but the way the gospel has like led me to surrender some of those things not because like I'm a good person, but like because it just like has made sense to me in a very meaningful way. It just changed me to where like I love what I do, and it's hard, it's frustrating, it's exhausting at times, especially in COVID. But I love what I do because I'm doing what I know God wants me to do, you know, and like that's a really good feeling to have. And so I think for people who like, yeah, if you're exploring like what you want to do in life, in this issue of injustice, systemic racism, white supremacy, like that gets under your skin as it should, then there are ways to represent a counter narrative with your life and what you do. It doesn't have to be like an eloquent post on Facebook, but they're actually kind of take the long road. That's what I was saying. Just take the long road. Don't. This is not about a shortcut answer to find some kind of like quick solution so you can move on to the next issue. Take the long road and ask the hard questions. And for me, that started in college. And you know, yeah, I'm just like I said, I would not do what I do if the gospel had not completely destroyed what I wanted to do and showed me a better way.
Yeah. And I have to apologize. I was just so excited about sharing that part of your story that I told it when I should have actually asked you to tell your
Oh
story.
no, you told it well.
um,
Yeah.
but yeah, like I still remember when you first mentioned that, how like, because that was so different from the way that I was thinking. Just in fact, there was a part of me that even said, well, our parents put in their due. All their success is owed to
Mm,
them. Like that whole Korean pride thing, and the
mm-hmm.
way of thinking about it is, it's so embedded in me that that was actually my first reaction. I was like, oh wait,
Mm,
I disagree with this guy. Like, there
mm-hmm.
shouldn't be
Mm-hmm.
no sense of gratitude because his parents, did what had to do. They did what they had to do to survive,
For
and they
sure.
thrived. But I did have to take a moment and say, well, but that doesn't mean that we can't show gratitude. No matter how hard you work at something, no matter how much you feel like you've done it all yourself, no one succeeds in a vacuum. And the community around you really does impact how well you do in life, like what kind of person you are, characteristics, personality, and all that. So it's impossible to sever that, to say
Mm-hmm.
the success is wholly my own. So I
Yeah.
actually, yeah, I wanted to, for a long time actually, Ben, I wanted to thank you for that, because it really did shift the
Oh,
way that I was
well,
thinking. Yeah. Um,
yeah. I mean, thank you for that. You know.
yeah. And this is, again, is kind of, I don't know if this is relevant to the conversation we're having, but you did
Mm-hmm.
kind of mention and allude to it a little bit, because I've been researching kind of healthcare and how it affects Black people disproportionately. And the way that I got to this, I talked about this in the previous episode, but when my wife was pregnant, she was watching and listening to a lot of birth stories and things like that. And she came across one podcast that was talking about how um, Black mothers disproportionately die in labor. Like, they disproportionately have complications in labor. So, as we talk about, systemic issues in the police force and things like that, is there something that we need to be talking about within the healthcare system? Kind of as an insider, I just wanted to ask you
Oh
if there's
yeah.
something there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm actually really glad you brought that up because kind of on the heels of what we just what I just was talking about. Like I don't want people to walk away from that story that me working at Grady. Like the point of that story is not to say like I'm some kind of hero, like at all. Like I am there to not only be the best doctor I can be, but change the system from a healthcare perspective to make it more equitable. Like
Wow.
so I am there with that, like that is my overarching mission. And so I'm not there just to be like a good doctor and feel good about myself, like having gratitude, like being a blessing. Like that's part of it, but I want to make the system better with what I've been given. Like I've had a great education, I've had opportunities to go to great schools and do all these things. Like I want to be a part of the fight to make this system more equitable. Yes, healthcare is rampant with disparities. It is rampant with inequities. Uh, African Americans are have had and continue to have the highest rates of death from any number of chronic diseases, heart disease, COPD, colorectal cancer, breast cancer, of all races, right? So that's a historical precedent that continues to this day. The gaps have narrowed somewhat, but they're still there, and they're not crossing lines, right? So we're not having Asians suddenly dying more than Black people, or whites dying more than Black people. Like, it's still African Americans lead in deaths. The reasons for that are complicated, right? There's structural factors. So if you grow up in a neighborhood where you don't have access to fresh produce, where you don't have good schools, right? So there's an educational disadvantage there. There's food insecurity. There's violence in the community. There's community level stress, the stress of racism, the stress of discrimination. All of that affects our health. And then it shows up in some of these outcomes that we looked at, like maternal mortality or infant mortality. And so the root cause of these, and this is part of why I care about this issue so much, is structural racism, systemic racism. Like, I see that, every Grady doc sees that in a concentrated way in these health outcomes that are so unfairly distributed on Black Americans. It is, it's just, I tell my students, like, don't let this depress you, let it piss you off. Like, it needs to make you mad. And it makes me mad. I mean, I'm still mad about it. Like, I don't know if you can tell. Like, I'm very, like, I get very passionate about this because it's so wrong. Like, it's not because, like, the narrative that, like, people just make bad decisions and they just need to take care of their bodies. Like, no, like, that is so wrong. That is so wrong, and it is not the complete truth. It's so complicated, but I guarantee you, if it was easy to take care of your body, people would have done it. And so when it comes to maternal mortality, so there are the structural factors, and then there are the factors like within healthcare itself, the biases that doctors have, the biases that nurses have. It's been well studied that Black women who get C-sections are treated less adequately for their pain when they have the same procedure as white women, as Asian women, as Latinx women. They just get less pain medicine. Why? Because when they cry out in pain, we have this gut reaction. Our implicit bias says, "Oh, I don't believe you. Like, you're trying to get some drugs. Like, you're trying to get some narcotics here, and, like, I'm not about that. I'm not about to, like, feed into your drug seeking habit." Like, and that's a bias that we have, and that's part of, like, what we have to undo in healthcare. So yes, if anybody says healthcare is implicated in this, I say, yes, we are. Amen. And we need people to fix it from within. We need to fix it. We need people to fix it from a legislative perspective. We need people to help fix it from all angles, really. But it's a problem, just like police brutality is a problem. So I think that, when people say, like, I know a cop and he's a good guy, it's like saying, I know a doctor and she's a great doctor, right? But that doesn't mean that there are not inherent problems in that system. I used to feel offended when someone would be like, man, healthcare is broke. I used to be like, well, I'm in healthcare. Like, I kind of take that personally, but it's true. It's like, it is what it is. Like, we are broken. We are an inequitable system. We treat those who are rich. We have a capitalist-based healthcare system that is not designed to prevent disease, but rather to treat disease. And so we don't have a great mechanism. We are disincentivized to prevent people from going to the hospital. When people come to the hospital and they get better, we make money. But when people stay well, never come to the hospital, we don't make money. So that's lost revenue. So there is a inherent problem in the way our health system is set up, that we are dependent on people getting sick. And that's effed up. I'm not going to cuss on your podcast, but that is really effed up. Yeah. And so that's one of the things that I want to be a part of fixing, because that is so wrong. And it just makes my blood boil.
Yeah, man. Yeah. But I'm so glad for your frank response, because I was at first I was like, should I even ask this question? Because
No, yeah. No, I mean, you got to go there. You absolutely got to go there. Yeah,
yeah.
because
So
it's the truth, and people should know. You know.
yeah, man, that's so good. That's so insightful because yeah, it's so hard to because I actually I'm trying to research, by race, how often do people like die under healthcare, like under the care of a doctor or nurse or whatever. Like I came across this one Johns Hopkins study that says 250,000 people died in 2014 because of either negligence or miscare
Yeah,
or
medical
whatever it is.
errors.
Yeah,
Hmm.
but then there's another study that says it's actually like 400,000 deaths annually. Like it's really just inconsistent, and I understand it's
Yeah,
probably really hard to track, and I found no
yeah.
studies at all based on race. So um,
Hmm.
I just from the statistics, I couldn't conclude what if there was even an issue. That's why I asked you. So I'm really glad
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
you shed light on that. Is there anything
Yeah,
that
I mean, yeah.
go ahead, sorry, go ahead. I'll ask after.
Well, I was just saying, like, there's been a number of studies that have shown this, but healthcare actually accounts for maybe 10 to 20% of of it, a person's health trajectory is accounted for 10 to 20% of the time by healthcare. Most of a person's health is actually determined by what we call the social determinants of health, where a person lives, works, plays. That actually has a greater effect on someone's health trajectory than what we do in the hospital. So, the work, so we want to keep people well as a society, we got to keep them out of the hospital because that's where the most of their, health trajectory is formed. What we do in the hospital, it's too late in a lot of ways by then. Like I'm
I
trying
see.
to mitigate the effect of disease, help prevent like further decompensation, help prevent things from getting worse. But if the disease is already there, especially if it's a chronic disease, it's hard to treat. Yeah.
I see. So is there anything that we can be doing? Because one thing that I keep like this, a lot of this is in a lot of ways overwhelming, right? Like when you start looking at
Mm-hmm.
social injustices, you look at police brutality, but then you dig deeper, and it's not just that. There's these private prisons that incentivize lower income people going to jail, that which breaks the family, and then like when the family's broken, there's all these other issues that so and like when I found out about this whole healthcare thing, it's just I can start to a little bit understand what Black people are going through, right? Like if I'm
Yeah,
just
yeah,
learning about it, they've been
yeah,
living it. So um,
yeah, right.
I don't know if this might be an impossible question, but is there anything that we can be doing, at least for the healthcare part of it, that we can help to change the system?
I think we have to act with our vote, and things like the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, as imperfect as it is, as much as it raises our premiums if you're middle class,
Mm,
if you're self-employed, that's why I think that the gospel speaks into that, right? The gospel speaks into how we vote for the Affordable Care Act. Why the heck would I vote for this policy that would raise my premium? I can only do that if I understand, if I vote for this policy, that means that more people are covered under healthcare. So it's like things like that, that as Christians, I think we really need to be challenged to think about.
mm,
You can't just think about your own interests as a believer. You can't just think about what it means for your own family, your own nuclear family. And I'm not saying that's easy at all, right? I'm not gonna pretend, and there's no illusion that this is easy.
yeah.
But I think that's like one way that we can start to think about it. We got to vote for things that might not directly benefit us, that in fact might cost us, because we care about the sense of equity, and because we desire to see a more equitable system. Because like you said, like when you actually take it all in, it is it's crushing to realize like what people are going through, like the reality of people. And so that's why I think, like, man, when you see the resilience of Black Americans in the midst of that, like that's amazing, right? Because like I don't know how it's, they're just blessed by God in that way. Like they just have the touch of God to be able to be resilient in the midst of unfair thing after unjust thing after inequitable thing, right? So I think, vote for things that benefit directly uh, people who have been marginalized or neglected or disadvantaged. That's one tangible way.
Yeah.
I think, so I'm a supporter of Medicare for all for that very reason.
Mm.
I'm not going to argue with anybody who says, guess what? It's going to make things more inefficient. It's going to make things more expensive. It's going to raise taxes. I'm not going to argue with that. I agree. Like, those are all potential risks. But you understand now why I would support a program like Medicare for all, right? Georgia, and I've said this on the KTL podcast before, Georgia has one of the most ridiculously strict Medicare requirements or Medicaid requirements. As a single household, I think if you make more than 9,000 a year, a single person in a one person household, if you make more than 9,000 a year, you don't get Medicaid, which means you don't get insurance, which means if you go to the emergency room, that $10,000 bill is on you. So like, if you make $12,000 a year working at some retail store, you can't get Medicaid. Like, to me, that's unjust.
Yeah.
Like, that's not fair. And like, people deserve to get some basic health needs met.
Yeah.
So the public can vote, can act with their votes. But I think in a broader conversation, not just healthcare, there's always opportunities to push equity from whatever space you're in, whatever career you're in. There is always a way to make things more equitable, more diverse, um, help increase representation, because that's part of the problem. Is like, a lot of these issues get neglected because a voice is missing from the table. That's very true in healthcare. You look at CEOs of health systems across the country, um, chairmen of departments, division directors. There's a very small proportion of those people who are people of color. And if they're not there at the table, then they're not going to be able to voice interest in cause action. So my boss is Black at Grady. And I mean, I got to share the story. Like, in February, I posted about this on Facebook. Like, I had this event happen to me when like stuff against Asian Americans, like kind of racist acts against Asian Americans was like really, it was just occurring all over the world, right? So this thing happened to me in clinic where I was coming to clinic. I was like sick the week before, and coronavirus is like starting to, it was actually like, it spread outside of Wuhan at the time, but it wasn't yet in this country, and a lot of people were like afraid of it. I wore a mask to clinic and like had so many people say so many racist things to me that day, right? And I wrote about it on Facebook, and it was like, I'm not going to spoil the story. If you want to read about it, go ahead, please. My point of the story is my boss, who's Black, saw that story, and she said, we need to have a bystander training, Emory-wide, right?
Wow.
So I don't know if a person who's white would have done that. She said, her what she came to me was like, are you willing to share this first? So like, she knew how to ask me, right? She knew how to ask me to share a painful story. Like, that's one thing. The second thing is, it was on her radar to think that this is a priority for other people to know, right? So this Black woman stood up for me to make sure that the rest of Emory is educated around how to address microaggressions against Asian Americans. That happened last month, right? So that's what happens when you diversify your leadership. You get those different viewpoints. I benefit from it as a Korean American, and so do other Korean Americans, right? So like, stuff like that is kind of how change happens on an incremental level. And so I think there's a lot of hope in that sense when we can diversify our leadership. And I'm proud that she's my boss. Like, I'm super proud she's my boss. She's an amazing person, and I can't imagine working for anybody else.
Yeah. It's funny. At one point in the podcast, you said you're not a hero, but I think you're constantly giving us traits as to why you are a hero. Because even sharing that story, I think is heroic. Given our background, given our kind of what our culture looks like. Because one thing that me and my wife really struggle with in terms of microaggressions is so often we say, well, they probably didn't mean anything by it. And we kind of sweep it under the rug and pass by. But for you to say and recognize that that's an issue and share and be willing to talk to your boss about it and things like that. Like you've paved the way for everyone coming after you, which is a
I
heroic
mean,
thing.
yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think it. Yeah, I mean, thank you. I appreciate that. It was definitely like a vulnerable thing, and we've actually had like two different kinds of trainings, and the second one was for like a smaller group, and I told that story live, and I couldn't get through it. I broke down crying because it was that painful still, and so. But I mean, yeah, I think I'm happy to stand up and and take the punches like that because that's nothing. All it costs me is being vulnerable, and I think I've been reading a lot of Brene Brown books lately, and if you don't know Brene Brown, you should read her. Like she has a really interesting take on what leadership is, and one of the things that she talks a lot about is leadership is this will or courage in leadership is this willingness to be vulnerable and to not be able to control the outcome, and that is what galvanizes people to follow. If you are willing to be vulnerable and show that side of you, people like latch onto that. And so I had read that book like last year, and I was like, man, I guess crap, like I guess I got to do this now because this is a very tangible way to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, and so I hope. What was cool about that event too, the larger one, was that there were a few people on the call who were older physicians, and they were like Chinese American, Korean American, and they reached out to me after, and they were like, "Man, thank you." And so I was really moved by that. Like these people who are more established in their careers, who are higher ranked than me, never had a conference like that for them, and they were kind of like, I feel seen now. And that is like one of the greatest feelings in the world, when you are seen as a Korean American, and that is okay. Like that, like to hear that from an institution, from your boss, from your colleagues, like that is special. And we're so used to it, like that. Like I know, David, like I just met you, right? But I know like you're used to not being seen. I am used to not being seen. I'm used to being like everything but Korean. But to have that like validated, Stan, you're great, and I love that you're Korean. Like that's part of why you're great. Like that's a really cool thing to hear and have acknowledged, and it makes me feel good that I work at Emory for sure.
And to just bring it full circle, um, that's not something that's afforded to a lot of our Black brothers and sisters. Like being celebrated for, like, because so much of their culture and history is just oppression. They're not really celebrated in that way that often. If anything, the what we're seeing a lot is, I mean, because there are always people who say the reason for the oppression is the fault of the Black people, and they list off whatever reasons. And
Mm-hmm.
it's so much of that. If I were Black and I was hearing that, I'd be like, man, like I wish I weren't Black. Like that would be my initial thought. And that's such a, like, to want to reject your identity, like something that you can't change and something that you should like be proud of, to have the world around you tell you that like you're worse off because of it. Like I can't even imagine. Yeah, because even for us, when we are acknowledged as Korean Americans, like Korean being the emphasis, like that just brings about a joy that like we don't feel that often. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, man.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, totally agree. And that's a problem of white supremacy
Yeah.
that says what's beautiful is white, skinny, and blonde. And I think that's infiltrated East Asia in a horrendous way, where people want to make their skin pale. They want to make their eyelids doubled. And I'm not to like critique anybody for doing that, but I think the ideal of beauty um, is not always emphasized as just who we are, right? And I think one of the beautiful narratives from African Americans is this kind of story of like beauty from ashes. Um, everybody around the world loves African American culture. Korean people can dance now because they've copied African Americans. So we like to pull from their culture all the things we want to, and then we and then implicitly say, but like we don't like you, right? And that's a really painful thing to have to hear and endure. And so again, to bring it full circle, right? When you go back to the lootings and you see that, right? You see everywhere on the world, everybody loves your culture, they love your music, they love your fashion, they love your shoes, right? But they don't love you enough to stand up for you and with you. That's painful,
Yeah.
right? And that's Han right there. Like that would create some Han in me,
Yeah.
that would bring that junk out, right? So I think we have to acknowledge some of those things. If you love Black culture, then you better stand up for Black culture. Like you better stand up for it, because otherwise you're extrapolating. It's colonialism. You're picking and choosing what you want and leaving everybody in the wake of your uh, treachery, so to speak. So yeah.
Man, this talk, I'm sorry, it took way longer than my
No, I love it.
expectations.
Yeah. I mean, I go all night. Yeah.
Yeah, but man, thank you so much for being on with us today. So much insight, and yeah, I'm really hoping that this really does give weight to everything that's happening, because like we were discussing, Korean Americans, we tend to keep to ourselves. We're really insulated, and so sometimes the gravity of the situations happening around us is not readily apparent. So I'm
Mhm.
hoping that today's conversation brings more light to that. Before we log off, is there anything that you wanted to discuss and talk about that I didn't catch?
Yeah. I mean, I think we covered a lot of things. And, I think, again, what I would say is like my sort of bottom line is that I love the Korean American church. I have great hope for the Korean American church. I think that it has a place, a meaningful place in our society, in this city. I think we need to expand our vision collectively of what that looks like. And it's not, I'll say, like, maybe provocatively, like, it's not just business as usual, like what we're doing now. It's not just Sunday morning service, some songs and a sermon, Wednesday night Bible study, some small groups during the week. Like, it's not just that. I think God wants us to engage in a deeper way with this city on a local level. And so that gives me a lot of hope, because I think that there are a lot of really gifted people, and again, the other thing I'll say too, and kind of part two to that is, and I hope that's come out here, is like, the reason I care about all these issues is not because I've rejected some part of the gospel, but to me, this is like, I have been changed by the gospel and I'm on this journey. So I'm not where I think 10 years from now, I hope I'm even, um, living in greater surrender. Maybe I won't be living in North Druid Hills. Maybe we'll be living in West End. Maybe we'll be living more proximally to Grady, right? So like, I want to be challenged and I don't want to be stagnant. And so I think maybe some of the fear that people have in engaging with these issues is that they think that it'll be in conflict with their faith, or that it'll be compromising some of their core values. But that couldn't be any further from the truth, at least for me. And so I love the Lord. I love the Korean American church. I have great hope for it. And I think that, I'm not mad at the Korean American church or anything like that. I think that we just gotta keep talking about stuff like this. And again, when you listen and you hear something that's true, that changes you. So that's a hard step to take. Are you willing to be changed? Like, that's a step number one. And so, because once you hear something, you can't unhear it. Once something is true to you, you can't untrue that. Like, it's going to change you. It's going to be a seed that grows. And so I would love for that seed to grow in anybody who's listening here. If anything resonated, especially if you're in youth group and you're wondering, like, what does God have for my life? Like, I hope any of this would kind of touch you and help you to realize, like, you matter, who you are matters, where you are matters. Black lives matter. But you know, like all those things are not by mistake, and because you go to the church you do is not by accident either. And so be bold, be courageous, and I'm happy to share my email. It's stansonu@gmail.com, stansonu@gmail.com. Like, I would love for anybody who has questions or wants to talk more about this stuff to email me. Again, I love the church, and like I wouldn't have done this if I didn't care. And so yeah, I'm happy to talk to anybody further.
Yeah, and I think it's really apparent in the conversation we had that you do have a heart for the church. And I'm really hoping anyone listening, I don't think it should come off this way, but I'm really hoping that no one took away that we're like criticizing the church. We're not saying that the
Yeah,
Korean
yeah, yeah.
American
I hope
church.
no, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously always have room for growth, and it's, you know, as like you were saying, one thing I did want to talk about is um, Atlanta, Georgia is unique in most of the cities in the US, in the sense that we're only really in the second generation of the immigrant Korean Americans. If you go to like LA, like DC, New York, Chicago, they're like on like
Mm-hmm.
their third or fourth generation. So their
Yep.
identities are much more established. So
Mm-hmm.
we're just adding to like what the Korean church can become. No way are we disparaging it, saying that it's unsalvageable or
Mm-mm.
that there's something
Mm-mm.
fundamentally wrong. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah,
And so,
yeah.
guys, if yeah, what we talked about resonated, you could email me at IHTHTpodcast@gmail.com, or Dr. Stan, as he said, stansonu@gmail.com, or reach out on Instagram at I hope they hear this, or on Twitter at IHTHT podcast. And if you feel like there are people who would be yeah, constructive in continuing this dialogue, please connect us, because that's kind of what happened here. You
Yeah.
are, I don't know if you mentioned it, but you're the brother-in-law of one of our previous guests, Jessica Wing, and she reached
Mm-hmm.
out saying, hey, my brother-in-law would be perfect to have this conversation. So that's how we got connected. So yeah, community,
Yep.
let's
Shout out to
keep,
Jessie. I'm so proud of her.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Let's keep this dialogue going. Let's keep talking and figuring out, you know, this all together. Because yeah, I think really we are at a crossroads. There is a turning point. Something is changing, so we don't want to miss out on that. So
Yeah.
thank you for everyone who tuned in, and thank you, Dr. Stan. I'm sorry, thank you,
Just
Stan.
Stan. Yeah.
Thank you, Stan, for being on, and yeah, we'll talk to you next time. Bye, guys.
Alrighty.